The question of what to do with troubled teenagers has been with us for a long time. Should they be cared for and understood, or should they be hit with the proverbial big stick? Do they need order? Do they need freedom to develop? Our subject on today's Great Lives is someone who spent his own life grappling with this very issue. His name was George Lyward, perhaps not a name that leaps out immediately as someone you recognise, but my guest here in the studio who chose him has said that George Lyward saved his life. This is the second time in my life that I've encountered Tom Robinson, musician and broadcaster. The first was at a gig in the Fairfield Halls in Croydon in the 1970s, the first and only time I ever went to such a thing. Tom Robinson had had a hit with Sing If You're Glad to Be Gay. I'll never forget the liberating feeling of singing that along with the crowd and feeling quite different, changed, on the train back to Clapham Junction. So thanks for that, Tom.
Oh,
tell us about your connection with George Lyward.
Well, I wasn't always glad to be gay, and certainly in my teens in the 60s, it was a time when gay men were sent to prison. I mean, it was still quite a serious punishable offence. And so when I was 15 and fell in love with another boy at school, it was like a cataclysmic disaster. I mean, the possibility of a happy life seemed to kind of close down on me. And, rather than admit that that was me, I would really literally rather have died. And that was the option I took. I took an overdose and tried to do away with myself.
Was it a cry for help or a serious attempt to kill yourself?
Probably a cry for help, I imagine. I mean, I took all the pills I could get my hands on, but it wasn't that many. But it precipitated a nervous breakdown, and just ceased to function. And by mid-afternoon, they'd rushed me off to a mental hospital in Cambridge, where I was pumped full of drugs and given ink blot tests and examined by psychiatrists and made to feel generally even more depressed than I was to begin with. And the last-ditch attempt, the last chance saloon that came my way was an interview to be seen at Finchden Manor in Kent, which was a therapeutic community for disturbed adolescents, as it was told to me. It was so much more than that. But it was a therapeutic community run by this man, George Lyward, about whom I knew nothing. And after I'd spent 2 hours in the company of this man, my dad later noted in his diary, the boy was transformed.
Give me your impressions of the place as you arrived.
It was a Jacobean manor house in fairly extensive grounds, with quite a lot of outbuildings, in a secluded part of Kent at the edge of Tenterden. And it was pretty run down, as you might imagine, with 50 adolescent young men and 10 staff and 8 dogs and countless cats, all kind of living cheek by jowl in it. The windows appeared to have been broken and mended and broken again and remended countless times. I didn't know what I was getting into. It was quite terrifying in a way. But then I was ushered into an oak-panelled study, and this man in his 70s, slightly stooping with an old tweed jacket. And
he was nearing the end of his life.
Yeah, I knew him for the last 6 years of his life, yeah. So he was peering over these dirty old plastic-rimmed spectacles, and just this glint in these eyes looking over the spectacles was quite unnerving. It was quite unlike anything else I'd encountered. And he took my hand in both of his and held on to it for much too long. I mean, so he started feeling uncomfortable as he hung on to it. And he just looked at me and he went, "You're very lonely, aren't you?" And I practically burst into tears on the spot, because none of the doctors who'd examined me, none of the psychiatrists, the nurses, my parents, not anybody had spotted that central fundamental fact about me.
And at the end of that 2 hours?
At the end of that 2 hours, I then went around the place. I had lunch with the boys, terrifying experience, in this kind of madhouse of wild, unkempt youth running riot, as it seemed, around the place. And then I came back to see him, and he said, well, we haven't got any places, and we don't normally take boys as sick as you anyway. Do you want to come? And I just went, yes! And it was like jumping in the dark. I didn't know what I was getting into. But I went, whatever it is, I'll have it, because compared to suffocating in this dark depression back at boarding school, where there seemed to be no way forward, this was life in the raw being offered to me. on a plate. It was unbelievable.
Here is the man himself. This is George Lyward, recorded in a 1971 Radio 4 documentary explaining the background to Finchden Manor.
In some ways, I feel that Finchden Manor is a form of hospitality. It's open, it, as it were, opens its arms to those who can come to it and accepts them as they are. What I find myself doing is seeing them from the start as very young children who are, for the most part, lonely, with a sense of not being certain as to whether they're wanted, and who, therefore, are glad, for the most part, to accept any group life which doesn't restrict them by rules and regulations, but does keep them firm by what I suppose could be called stern love.
Two phrases there, Tom Robinson, from George Lyward, between which there's a certain tension. One is hospitality, and the other is stern love. What did he mean by both?
I suppose from the hospitality point of view, because Finchden Manor didn't grow up as an institution that was kind of ordered with a preordained structure, but grew up slowly and organically from George Lyward and his wife having boys to stay with them, first 1 or 2 and then 3 or 4 and then 7 or 8, as guests in their house. That was the origin of the community.
And stern love, now a forebear which I'd never realised to the now very fashionable phrase tough love. What did he mean by that?
He could be very stern indeed. If he tolerated forms of behaviour or activity or just ways of being that you brought with you, it wasn't because anything goes. It wasn't because you could do what you like, but it was because he would understand a compulsive need to behave in a certain way for a certain time until that could fall away as unnecessary.
George Lyward was an educationalist. He established Finchden Manor in Tenterton, Kent, as you've said, in the 1930s, in fact, and it was to become his life's work. Our expert witness today is Dr Norman Alm. He was a member of George Lyward's staff at Finchden Manor from 1967 until 1973 and taught Tom Robinson.
I did, yes. Tom and I did A-level English together.
How easy was he to work with, Norman?
We used to call him GL. So I will call him GL. It's easier for me to do that. GL used to hate it when people would say to him, as they would quite often, George, you treat your friends as patients and your patients as friends. This is because it was a degree of truth about all this. Similarly, the staff and boys, young men at Finchden, were treated more or less the same. And one side of that coin is GL always said, we are people here together. That's the most important thing about what's going on here. So he didn't like labels or roles. So as a staff member, I certainly felt just as vulnerable as any of the boys to, for instance, GL's wrath, which was unpredictable. But also, there was a difference between the staff and the boys. It wasn't quite apparent on the surface, but the staff tried to, at all times, act in such a way that the atmosphere and that the feeling and the sort of the surroundings, the emotional landscape of Finchden was maintained the way that worked best, and that emanated from GL, from George Lyward, but the staff tried as best they could to be his arms and eyes and ears and legs and just make that all happen.
That's an interesting analogy, arms, eyes, ears, legs, and one individual, one mind, one personality, absolutely at the centre of things. Was there anything egomaniac about him, do either of you think?
Well, quite the opposite. And in fact, one of the paradoxes about George Lyward is one of my first impressions of him when I first came down for an interview was I was amazed and shocked at how insecure he seemed about his reputation. So, no, egomaniac, no. Autocratic, yes.
Give me a sense of a typical day at Finchden. What did you do? And also his presence in all that.
I knew him in the last 6 years of his life, so he was far less active in the community than he had been as a younger man, and that other people describe. So his appearance would be arbitrary, sudden, unexpected. He might just appear and a group of boys would gather around him and he'd start talking and teasing, and a discussion would grow up. He might call what was called a session, and everybody in the house, including the staff, would all come into a room together. And a talk would develop, and it might be because somebody's dog had killed a neighbouring farmer's sheep, or because some catastrophe had happened, or because something good was going to happen, like a dance or a play or something. But those sessions were instituted by him, so there was a direct relationship there. But as to what we did all day, I mean, when he wasn't in there was everything and nothing to do. You could just lie in the grass on the field, staring up at the sun, reading a book, or just chatting beside the boiler in the wash-up, or helping.
Sounds idyllic.
Helping out in the kitchen.
I wish my school had been like that.
It was fantastic, because time seemed infinite, and what Finchden offered you, above all, where your life had become battened down and closed in and going nowhere, it offered you respite. And there was a complete respite from all forms of nagging and pressure. And my dad had been like pushing me through A-levels, and that was what really kind of precipitated the nervous breakdown more than anything, was A-level. And when I got there, I said to him, well, when am I going to take my A-levels? And he just said, the hell with your A-levels! and that was, I mean, shocking, but that also incredibly liberating. And that nothing was expected of you. All that expectation, all that pressure, all that when you're going to go to university, are you going to get a decent job, all removed, and you could just be a child in a teenager's body.
I want to get a sense of how George Lyward the man became George Lyward the educationalist. Norman, tell me just a little bit, in a nutshell, about his family and upbringing.
Well, George Lyward was born in London and lived in Clapham in quite poverty-stricken circumstances. He was a very ambitious young man. He had developed polio. He was reasonably frail as a young man, but he had this burning ambition to get on. He got a choral scholarship to Cambridge, went to Cambridge, and after that he thought he would train for the ministry, decided that wasn't for him.
And he had breakdowns of his own.
He did. Well, what happened after he didn't do the ministry was he then had a very successful career as a public school teacher. He was at Glen Almond in Scotland and made quite a reputation there. And then at the end of that period, his whole life had been by his own account, quite a frenetic pace, and he had a lot of things to deal with from his background. And it all sort of came to a head, and he had a breakdown and had to leave Glen Almond. And that was actually, paradoxically, that was the start of this whole career of therapy, because the psychiatrist that treated him recognized his talents in dealing particularly with young men with emotional difficulties. And he was set up in a small country home with 2 or 3 patients. This grew and grew and grew. Eventually he found Finchden. And on the question of, did it work? Well, the whole Finchden was built on his reputation to help people, and he did over many years.
It's worth pointing out, Tom, that although Finchden was in no sense a state institution, it couldn't have survived without state money with the 1944 Education
Absolutely.
Act helped pay the fees.
I was sent by the local education authority because, as it was explained to me, they understood, the county council understood that you would save money by sending somebody to Finchden rather than paying prison fees for them for the rest of their life. The one thing I'd like to add to Norman's account of how GL came to teach, he did describe a key moment as a teenager when he was just helping out in a classroom full of children, very young children. He just had a blinding insight. He went, these are people. They're not children, they're not different, we're in a room full of people there together. And that was the key thing about the way he treated all of us, was it was person to person, not as adult to young person or as teacher to pupil.
You're listening to Great Lives on BBC Radio 4, where my guest Tom Robinson is discussing the life of the educationalist George Lyward with the expert help of Dr Norman Alm. Help me with something I don't quite get, both of you, about Lyward's philosophy. He was apparently against indebtedness, against feeling that you owed people things for your help. He thought it diminished people. What did he mean by that? It seems to me part of the oils the wheels of society, ideas of indebtedness.
Well, he did have a curious relationship with debt, in that he would sometimes, among the many interventions that he would make in communal life, which would just disrupt things and throw things, like, for instance, coming in and demanding that everybody changes rooms and posting a new list of rooming arrangements, so just churned the kaleidoscope. Well, one of those interventions was to come and say, all debts cancelled. And everybody who owed anybody any money lost it, just there and then. That's it, all debts cancelled. And once, famously, he came in, all debts doubled and reversed. Which was like a completely amazing intervention. But and he would come in, and it might be a good thing or it might be a bad thing. So you might come down to breakfast and he'd be there and he'd send you back to bed with a flea in your ear for coming down late, or he might say, give that boy bacon and eggs.
But Norma, don't educationalists generally say that what children need is structure in their lives? They need certainty. They need to know what the consequences of their actions will be. And isn't what Tom is describing exactly the opposite of that?
He didn't like to talk about discipline. He liked to talk about a discipline. So that if you wanted to learn how to, for instance, defense, you had to learn the rules. It's no good flopping about with the fool. You had to learn to do it properly. So Finchden was all about self-discipline, developing. Now, that takes patience, it takes time. Ultimately, not only is it the same goal, which is structure and order and politeness and all these things that we value, but it's actually real and has roots.
You said, Tom, that you didn't think that he liked the idea of debt or indebtedness, and yet the idea of being lucky in life and paying something back to society, that's got to be right, hasn't it? Isn't that what you're doing too? That's
definitely worth doing, and I think incumbent upon one if you're lucky enough to get into that position. But I think for George Lyward, maybe it was something more than that. I think he was continuing to help himself all his life by helping others. It wasn't that he had been the lucky recipient of psychiatric help when he had his breakdown and therefore paid that back to people. It was ongoing that he found his own salvation in offering it to others.
You mentioned salvation, and he had a very complicated relationship with faith. It's not clear exactly what he believed, but it is clear that it was very important to him. And in this clip, we have him explaining the role faith plays in his school.
The only way you can really live is by faith. And all the psychopathology and all the categories and all the rest of it can't do away with the fact that in the last resort we are confronted minute by minute with the unknown. There is always a danger, if you say God is love, of saying love is God, which might not be acceptable theologically. This is one of the great issues, isn't it, as to how far you can, this for young people at the moment especially, and I mean they know that they are forgiven before they have committed the crime.
Norman, he sounds almost messianic there.
He had this capacity for diving deep. No matter what discussion you were having, suddenly you felt like it was connected with very, very deep issues. Now, if you want to call those spiritual, that's fine. But that was always there. It might be historical. I mean, he was a very knowledgeable, wonderful ex-school teacher, and he could bring in examples from history and from literature to illustrate the most mundane of points. But I always felt that he took everything down to he gave everything a deep resonance, which was really quite startling.
Was he aware of his charismatic power, do you think?
Oh, yes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, on the point of faith, he did used to say that, we're only holding hands in the dark. And in the dark, faith is just a lantern that will only show you one step ahead. But it's enough for you to take that one step. And when you take it, it moves forward with you. And you can then see to take the next step, and that you need faith to take those single steps just to see your way through this journey of blackness. I mean, he's aware of the dark side of life for all of us that we face and grapple with, and didn't shy away from it or pretend it wasn't there.
Not everyone saw Finchden as a good thing. Some visitors questioned the role of staff, whom, one person said this, that the staff seemed to do little except watch the boys. Lyward's response being, watching is one of the hardest things to do in life. They look for when the boy comes alive. They then nurture the boy's talent and help them shape their future life. Tom, did you ever feel uncomfortable being watched? Did you know you were being watched?
I think the journey that I made, and I think that probably a lot of us made, was from unawareness to awareness, and you came there quite blind in your own little wrapped-up cotton wool world, not really aware of other people as people, but thinking about your own problems and issues and feelings, and stuff. And gradually, over the course of 5 or 6 years that I was there, awareness grew, and I think I became more aware of being watched as I was more aware of other people around me. But I was also increasingly aware that that was a kind of a benign thing.
You talk about critics of Finchden. I mean, any number of people who would come down would have been and were appalled at the scruffiness of the boys, at the rough and ready Spartan nature of the place, at the apparent lack of controls. So that was there. The reason it was allowed to continue was because it was successful.
Now was it? I wondered, Tom, whether you were successful there. It saved your life in lots of ways. I wonder whether you've been slightly blinded by the positive importance it made for you. And in fact, the place was much more mixed in its results. Did you get the impression it was working for everyone?
I've had a much more balanced view since we founded the Finchden website, because there we've now, purely thanks to technology, been able to reach the scattered masses of people who pass through Finchden Manor and get in touch with so many old boys who've been coming through, and we have a kind of online community there. And there you do hear dissenting stories. You get some people who absolutely hated their time there. But on the whole, you can get a broad feel that I think more than 50% of the people who went there got something out of it that had a positive effect. And compare that to, say, an approved school or any of the young offenders institutions of the day, and their recidivism rate was about 19%.
I'd like to return to the central issue that I raised at the beginning, which is how we, as a society, should deal with troubled teens. And here's a clip of George Lyward himself explaining his approach, to the extent it can be explained.
I have lived for 41 years with thieves. When they're very sick and very near to being psychopaths or schizophrenics, the demands they make on one's time and energy, well, their intrusions upon one's private life, make them the biggest thieves of all. Now, it all sounds as if I'm up against them, these modern. I'm not up against them. I think that this is where they've reached in their reaction against society or against adults and an educational system which tried to shape them without very much regard for what was, as it were, trying from within to give them their own individual shape.
Now, here's the opposite point of view from Sir Max Hastings, writing in the Daily Mail after the London riots last summer. They are victims, he said, of perverted social ethos which elevates personal freedom to an absolute and denies the underclass the discipline, tough love, he used the expression, which alone might enable some of its members to escape from the swamp of dependency in which they live. Who's right, Tom, George or Max?
Well, at the beginning of this programme, we heard George Lyward himself talking about the kind of boys that he was able to help. And he said, you see them as children who are for the most part lonely and who are not certain that they're wanted. And if you see some of the interviews with some of the kids who were caught in the riots, I think that's absolutely the case. The emotional neediness of those people who have not been certain that they're wanted, who have felt completely at a loose end, a rejected generation. And you see the ones who've managed to come through it and be saved through belonging to a local church or through youth workers and things. You just see how inappropriate banging them up in a cell is as a way of getting them to change their ways. I mean, I understand that people would want retribution for evil deeds, and there is a strong urge to, punish where bad has been done. But we have to ask ourselves, I think, as a society, what the outcome we want is. Do we want to have the satisfaction of knowing we've punished them, or do we want them not to do it again in the future? And if what we want is for them to not carry on doing it, then we have to address the needs of the people concerned.
Yeah, but I don't think Max is talking about retribution here. He's talking about rules. He's saying people need rules, people need structure. Had George been alive today, how would he have reacted to those riots? What would he have said?
He was really dealing with individuals, and we're talking about a political, sociological thing when you're looking at the riots. But one thing I think he might have commented, and it's certainly something I took when I left Finchden and went on and worked in a social work setting, is that people need to have a stake in the group that they're in. If they need to feel like they're participating, like they matter. Now, if you have a group of young men in particular in any society who feel they have nothing to lose and they have no stake, then you've got a problem. And I think all political commentators agree on that, just what the solution might be.
George Lyward received an OBE in 1970. He died in 1973, and though attempts were made to keep Finchden going after his death, it was forced to close. At his memorial service, John Prickett, who was on the staff, said this of him: "If, however, there is one factor common to the attitudes and methods I've mentioned, it's that they are all addressed to the deeper levels of the personality, where alone significant change is generated. Taken all in all, I suspect they amount to a change of climate, involving freshness of perception, of insight, of creative relationship, which may help to determine our ways of seeing disturbed and disturbing adolescence for quite a long time to come." Now this is the question. Did he have a theory, or was he just a charismatic person? You haven't convinced me that there is actually a theory here, either of you, only that there was a very, very charismatic man, and we've all had teachers like that.
I think there were some key aspects to what he did that I've carried with me into my life and found valuable, which is fairness is overrated. Life isn't fair. You shouldn't try to give the same to all your children. Treat them as individuals. It's unpredictability and fluidity in preventing things from settling down into just becoming fixed and routine in one's response to things. Respond in the moment, respond person to person, treat other people as people, not as children, and respect, basic, simple human respect for the people that you're dealing with would actually obviate an awful lot of the problems that we're facing in our society.
Tom, you said at the outset that he didn't believe in debt. But I wonder whether you feel some kind of a debt to him, and whether you're choosing him as your great life is a way of repaying that debt.
He did so much for me. I don't think I can ever actually repay it. But trying to talk about him when there's an opportunity seems a small way to give something back.
My thanks to Tom Robinson for championing the life of George Lyward, and to Norman Alm for being our expert witness. Goodbye.